My grandson did not come home that Thursday night, and I was not surprised. What surprised me was the knock on my door at 7 the next morning. Not his knock, not the lazy 3 taps he'd always done since he was small, but a sharp, impatient sound, like someone collecting a debt. I opened the door in my housecoat, my hair still pinned from the night before. He was standing on my porch with a garbage bag in each hand, and a girl I'd never seen before pressed against his side. She was young, maybe 23, with acrylic nails and a look on her face like she was already bored of being there. "We need to stay here for a while," he said. Not a question. Not even close. I should have said no right then. I know that now. But he was 26, and he was my daughter's boy. And my daughter had been gone 11 years, and every time I looked at him, I saw her nose, her stubborn chin, the way she used to tilt her head when she'd already decided something and was just waiting for you to catch up. So I stepped aside and let them in. That was the first of many times I would step aside. It would take 9 months, a broken wrist, and a visit from a woman I hadn't spoken to in 4 years before I finally stopped. My name is Rosalind. I'm 67 years old, and I've lived in the same house in Kitchener, Ontario for 31 years. My husband passed in 2009, cardiac event they called it, which always struck me as a strange, bloodless phrase for something that cracked your whole life in two. After Dennis died, I rattled around this house alone for a while, and then my grandson Callum came to stay. He was 15 at the time. His mother, my Kathleen, had died when he was 4, and his father, a man I'd never much cared for, had been in and out of his life the way weather moves through in March, unpredictable, cold, and never staying long enough to do any good. Callum grew up mostly between me and his aunt, my younger sister's family over in Guelph. But by the time he was a teenager, the aunt's house had gotten crowded, and Callum was getting harder to manage. So he came to me. I want to be honest about this part, because I think it matters. Callum was not an easy boy. He never had been. There was a chip on his shoulder that had been put there by years of being passed around, and I understood it. I really did. But understanding where a wound comes from does not make it stop bleeding on you. Still, he was mine. He was the last real piece of Kathleen I had, and I loved him with the kind of love that doesn't ask for anything back, which, I was slowly learning, is a very dangerous way to love someone. The first year was Callum and the girl. Her name was Destiny, though I never used it, not even in my own head. Not really. Was not terrible. That's the thing about these situations. They start with just enough normal that you can almost believe you're imagining the rest. Callum worked at a warehouse out on the edge of town. He paid $200 a month toward groceries, which was less than what he should have contributed. But I didn't push. Destiny didn't work, and when I asked once, gently, whether she was looking for something, she gave me a smile that didn't reach her eyes and said she was figuring things out. I didn't ask again. By spring, the $200 had stopped. Callum said he'd had his hours cut. I checked the hydro bill one afternoon, the heat they ran in their room, the gaming console he plugged into my spare room, and I just sat at the kitchen table and looked at the number for a long time. He borrowed money for the first time in April. $200. His car needed a part, he said. I gave it to him because I believed him, and also because I had not yet learned that belief, like credit, has a limit. You should enforce before it gets extended too far. In August, it was $500. His phone bill, he said. I was on a fixed income, Denise's pension, and my own CPP, which together came to just over $2,000 a month. I owned the house outright, which was the only reason any of this was sustainable at all. But the $500 stung. I said I didn't have it. He sat across from me at this very table and said very quietly, "Grandma, I thought family helped each other." I want you to sit with that sentence for a moment, because it was not yelled, it was not a threat. It was said in the same voice he'd used as a 6-year-old when he wanted an extra cookie, and it worked. I transferred the money that afternoon. By October, something had shifted in the house that I could feel but couldn't name, the way you can feel a change in the air before a storm, that particular heaviness. Callum had stopped talking to me in the mornings. He and Destiny kept odd hours, sleeping until noon, and the sounds from their room, the television, the arguments in low voices, the silences that somehow felt louder than the arguments, had started to colonize my sense of peace in my own home. I stopped having my friend Josepha over for our Wednesday visits. Josepha and I have been friends for 22 years. We'd met at a grief support group after Dennis died, and she'd since become the kind of friend you call when things are genuinely bad. But I was ashamed. I was ashamed of the state of the kitchen, which Destiny left cluttered without apology. I was ashamed of what I might say if Josepha asked the right question, and I didn't have the energy to lie. So I started lying to myself instead, which is easier and much more destructive. The first time Callum raised his voice at me in a way that made me physically step backward, it was over the thermostat. I had turned it down to 18 degrees, a reasonable temperature, what most people in this country heat their homes to, and he came down the stairs and turned it back to 22 without speaking to me, and when I said, "Callum, the heating bill," he turned around and looked at me with a flatness in his eyes that I had never seen before in all the years of raising him. "You own a house," he said. "You have Dennis's pension. You have the RRSP. Stop acting like you're broke." I knew about the RRSP because I'd mentioned it once, years ago, in passing when we were talking about Dennis' retirement planning. That he had stored it, filed it away to use later. That shook something loose in me. But I still didn't act. I just turned and went back to my room and sat on the edge of my bed the same way I imagine a lot of women my age have sat on the edges of their beds, holding very still, listening to the sound of the house that used to be theirs. I need to tell you about the wrist because that is where everything changes. It was a Tuesday in November, late afternoon, the light already going the way it does here in autumn, that quick gray collapse that happens before 4 o'clock. I was in the kitchen making soup. Callum came in from somewhere, I don't know where, and he was in a state I recognized by then. Not drunk exactly, but with a kind of electrical charge to him, a jumpiness that meant something had gone wrong outside these walls, and I was going to be the one who absorbed it. I said nothing. I had learned to say nothing when he came in like that. He opened the refrigerator, closed it hard, opened a cupboard, closed it hard. Then he turned around and said that Destiny had told him I'd asked her that morning when she planned to find work. I had said it as kindly as I knew how to. I had said, "Have you thought about maybe picking up some shifts somewhere, even part-time just for yourself?" "You're making her feel unwelcome," he said. "Callum, you've always done this. You act like you're being helpful and then you make people feel like they owe you something." "That's not what I meant. Stop talking." He said it sharply, and I stopped. And then he moved toward me, not to hit me, I don't think that was his intention, but to reach past me to the counter, and his arm came out sideways and struck my wrist hard against the edge of the stove. The pain was immediate and blinding. I heard a sound. I didn't know for a moment whether it was the pot or my wrist. It was my wrist. He left the room. He didn't say sorry. He didn't look back. I stood at the kitchen sink and ran cold water over my arm and looked out the window at my backyard. My bird feeder, the oak tree Dennis had planted our first spring here, the garden beds I'd turned under for winter. And I did not cry. I was past crying by then. What I felt instead was something I'd never felt before, not in 67 years of living. A cold, clean fury. Quiet. Almost like relief. I drove myself to the walk-in clinic. The doctor, a young woman who looked barely older than Destiny, asked how it had happened. I said I'd caught it on the cupboard door. She wrapped it, told me it was a minor fracture, and said I should keep it elevated. She gave me a card for a physiotherapy place on King Street. On the way home, I did not go home. I drove instead to a coffee shop on Victoria, ordered a tea I didn't drink, and sat for a long time. I thought about Kathleen. I thought about what she would say if she could see this. My Kathleen was not a woman who put up with things quietly. She got that from Dennis, that directness, that refusal to be moved by guilt. She would have looked at me and said, "Mum, what are you doing? What are you actually doing?" I thought about Josepha. I had not called her in 3 months. I took out my phone and dialed her number. She picked up on the second ring. Josepha Adeyemi is 69 years old, and she was, before she retired, a family court mediator for the province of Ontario for 27 years. She has seen, in her words, every variety of human cruelty that families can manage to produce, and she is not easily shocked. She is also the most methodical person I have ever known. When she makes a plan, she makes it the way good contractors build foundations, slowly, carefully, and built to outlast whatever comes. I told her everything. Not just the wrist, everything. The money, the thermostat, the way Destiny left cups on my grandmother's side table without coasters, the way I had started checking whether Callum's car was in the driveway before I came in from the grocery store, the way I had stopped being the person this house was built around and started being someone who lived in it on sufferance. Josepha listened without interrupting, which she is good at. When I finished, there was a pause, and then she said, "Roz, how long have you been living like this?" 9 months, I said. "And how long are you going to?" I didn't answer because I didn't have to. We both already knew. "I want you to listen to me," she said. "This is what we're going to do." What followed was 3 weeks of the most deliberate preparation I have ever undertaken. I did not let on at home. I continued making dinner. I continued saying good morning. I let Destiny borrow my umbrella when she asked and did not mention she'd left it on the porch. I was, to all appearances, the same woman I'd been for 9 months, worn down, compliant, invisible in my own kitchen. But at 9 o'clock every morning, after Callum and Destiny were asleep, I sat at the little desk in my bedroom and I worked. Josepha connected me with a lawyer, a real one, not a consultation, a proper retainer. Her name was Miss Iris Okafor, and she was sharp in the way of someone who has spent years being underestimated and has used every single one of those years productively. She walked me through the Residential Tenancies Act, which confirmed that even without a formal lease, Callum and Destiny were considered tenants and that I had the right, through proper notice, to reclaim my home. She also noted that given the circumstances, she advised me to document everything going forward. I bought a small notebook, navy blue, from the drugstore and I wrote down every incident. Dates, times, what was said, what was not said. The notebook filled faster than I expected. Josepha also made one other call, one I hadn't asked her to make, but that I was grateful for, beyond what I could properly express. She called my older brother's wife, Glenda, who I had barely spoken to since a falling out at Dennis's funeral over something I can hardly remember now. Josepha, without my knowledge, told her the bare facts. Not the full story. Just, Rosalind is in a difficult situation with her grandson and she's handling it, but she shouldn't have to handle it alone. Glenda called me that evening. I almost didn't answer. When I did, she didn't say anything about the funeral or the years between. She just said, "Tell me what you need." I told her. She was at my house the following Saturday. The morning I had decided on was a Sunday in December. The first real snow had come the night before, the kind that settles properly and makes the whole neighborhood quiet. I had been awake since 4. By 6:30, I had made a full breakfast. Real breakfast. Not just toasts, but scrambled eggs, back bacon, sliced fruit, a pot of proper coffee, and a pot of tea. I set the table with the good dishes. I pressed a tablecloth. I put out cloth napkins. I lit the candle in the center of the table, because Dennis had always said that candles made a meal feel intentional, like someone meant for you to be there. I was not cooking for Callum. I was cooking because my hands needed something to do, and because I had learned over 67 years that there is a particular kind of calm that comes from doing something with skill and care when the world around you is about to change entirely. At 8:45, I heard movement upstairs. By 9, Callum appeared in the kitchen doorway in his sweatpants and a t-shirt, hair still flat from sleep. He looked at the table and stopped. "What's all this?" he said. "Sit down," I said. "Have some breakfast." He was wary, I could see it, but the smell of the food was working on him, and he pulled out a chair and sat. A few minutes later, Destiny came down too, glanced at me without much expression, and sat beside him. They ate. I stood at the counter with my tea and watched them, and I thought about Kathleen, and I thought about Dennis, and I thought about who I had been before I started shrinking myself to fit around other people's comfort. At 9:15, the doorbell rang. Callum looked up. "Who's that?" "Some people I invited," I said. I went to the door. Josepha was first, in her good winter coat, her hair pinned back, the kind of compose that comes from decades of walking into difficult rooms and not being the one who blinks. Behind her was Glenda, who I had not seen in 4 years and who reached out and squeezed my hand without saying anything. And behind Glenda was Ms. Okafor, who had agreed as a particular courtesy, not a standard service, to be present for what came next. I brought them into the dining room. Callum saw Josepha and something shifted in his face. He'd met her twice before, years ago, and he knew who she was and what she did for a living. He didn't know Glenda was coming, and the sight of her, Dennis's family, the family he'd always known I'd been estranged from, threw him further. He looked at Ms. Okafor and couldn't place her. "Grandma," he said, and his voice had gone careful, that particular careful of someone who knows the terrain has changed but hasn't mapped it yet. "What's going on?" "We're going to talk," I said. I sat down at the head of my table, Dennis's chair, the one I'd avoided sitting in for 11 years because it still felt too large for me, and I sat in it fully, both feet on the floor, and I placed my bandaged wrist on the table where everyone could see it. The room went very still. Josefa spoke first, the way she always did, because she understood that the first voice in a room sets the temperature. "Callum," she said, and her tone was the tone I imagined she'd used in 27 years of family court. Not unkind, but completely without softness. "I've known your grandmother for over 20 years. I've watched her hold this family together through grief that would have taken other people down. What I'm going to tell you isn't a surprise, but I want you to hear it clearly from someone who has no reason to exaggerate." She looked at him until he looked back. "The situation in this house has to end." He started to speak. "This is a family thing, you don't have to be," and she simply continued as though he hadn't. "Your grandmother has sustained an injury to her wrist that she received in this kitchen. She drove herself to the clinic. She said it was a cupboard door." Josefa paused. "It was not a cupboard door." Destiny put her fork down. "Beyond the physical," Josefa continued, "your grandmother has been supporting both of you financially, absorbing your living costs, your heat, your food, while receiving $200 a month that was eventually reduced to nothing, while being told that she was the one being unreasonable." She let the sentence land. "Callum, I'm telling you this in front of people who care about your family because your grandmother was too generous to say it in front of anyone, and that generosity has cost her." Callum looked at me, not at Josefa, at me, and for a moment, just a moment, I saw him. Not the man who'd come home with garbage bags and a stranger, not the tight-jawed person who'd been counting up what I owed him. I saw the boy who'd arrived here at 15 with a garbage bag of his own all those years ago and a look on his face like he was braced for another disappointment. I had to look away because it would have cost me everything to cry right then. "Ms. the Missies." Okafor opened the folder she brought and slid a document across the table. "This is a formal N12 notice under the Residential Tenancies Act," she said, in a tone that was entirely professional and entirely unmovable. "It gives 60 days for vacating the premises. The date has been calculated from today. I want to be clear that this is the legal path and that it has already been initiated." Callum stared at the document. "You got a lawyer," he said. "Yes," I said. "You got a lawyer against your own family." "I got a lawyer," I said, "because your grandmother needed someone to speak a language you were willing to hear." Silence. Destiny said, quietly, to Callum, "We should go upstairs." And to her credit, and I mean this genuinely, because in 9 months I had found very little to extend credit to her for, she reached out and put her hand on his arm and said it again, not as a dismissal, but as an act of small mercy. And they went. What followed was not easy. I want to be honest about that because I think it does no one any good to make these moments sound cleaner than they are. Glenda stayed for 3 days. She slept in Kathleen's old room, which I had kept exactly as it was. And in the evenings, we sat in the living room after supper and talked, really talked, for the first time in years. We talked about Dennis's funeral and what had actually happened and how grief makes people ugly sometimes and how long it had taken both of us to get to the other side of it. By the second evening, the falling out seemed very small and very far away, which I think is the mercy of time, if you're willing to let it work. Callum left 41 days later, not 60. He found a place, a bachelor apartment in Cambridge with a friend from the warehouse, and one Tuesday morning I heard him loading his things into the truck. I stayed in my bedroom until I heard the truck pull away. Then I went downstairs and stood in the kitchen and looked at the table. There was a note under the sugar bowl. His handwriting, which was terrible, always had been. "Grandma, I know I don't have the right to ask for anything. I don't have excuses. I've been thinking about what Josefa said, and I keep coming back to the part about you driving yourself to the clinic and telling them it was the cupboard. I didn't know you'd done that. I don't know what I thought you did. I'm sorry. I don't expect that to fix anything. I'm sorry about the money too. I'm going to pay you back. Maybe not quickly, but I'm going to. I love you. I know I made that hard to believe. Callum. I read it twice. I put it in the drawer with Dennis' letters. The months after were the strangest kind of quiet. I had spent so long flinching at ordinary sounds, footsteps on the stairs, a door closing, that the actual silence took some getting used to. My nervous system apparently had learned a new setting and needed time to unlearn it. I called my doctor, who referred me to a counselor, a practical woman named Dr. Hennessy, who worked out of an office on Weber Street and who spent our first session asking me questions about what I had liked to do before, what I had stopped doing, and what I thought the difference was. It was the kind of conversation that feels simple and turns out to be very hard, and I left that first appointment and sat in my car in the parking lot and cried for 20 minutes. Then I drove home and called Josefa and told her I'd gone, and she said, "Good, now go again." So I went again. And again. And slowly I started doing the things I had stopped. I had Josefa for tea on Wednesdays the way we used to. I called Glenda every Sunday. I rejoined the community garden on Glasgow Street that I had quietly let my plot lapse in. I bought a new bird feeder for the backyard because Destiny's cat had knocked the old one over and I'd never replaced it. In March, Callum texted me. He'd found a better job. Still warehousing, but with a company that offered benefits, and he'd enrolled in night classes at Conestoga toward a certificate in supply chain logistics. He and Destiny had split up, which he mentioned briefly and without much emotion, the way people do when they're trying not to make a bigger deal of something than it needs to be. I texted back that I was glad about the job and the classes. I didn't say anything about Destiny. We started meeting every few weeks. Tim Hortons, halfway between Kitchener and Cambridge, a small table by the window. He always arrived first and had my tea waiting. Double-double, which he'd never remembered when he lived with me, but remembered now. We talked about small things mostly. His classes, my garden, the hockey team he still followed even though he didn't have a television. The silences between us were awkward at first, and then, gradually, less so. I did not let him come to the house. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I hadn't decided. Josefa said that was my right and that I didn't owe anyone a timeline on it, including myself. I thought about Kathleen a lot that spring, what she would have made of all of it. She had loved Callum so fiercely, with the particular fierceness of a mother who knows time is short, though she didn't know that when she did it. I hoped she could see that I was still here, that I had found my way back to her table and sat down at the head of it. I'm not going to tell you that everything is fixed, because it isn't. A fracture heals, but it leaves something behind. The wrist still aches when the weather turns. Nothing dramatic. Just a reminder, which I have decided to receive as exactly that, a reminder rather than a wound. What I can tell you is that my house is mine again. The mornings are mine. The thermostat is set to the temperature I choose, which is 18, because Dennis always said that under a good duvet, 18 degrees is perfectly civilized. I drink my tea at the kitchen table with no one's schedule running through my head but my own. Josefa comes on Wednesdays. Sometimes Glenda drives up and joins us. Last month, we sat on the back porch until dark, and Josefa told a story so funny that I laughed until I was wiping my eyes, and somewhere in the middle of that laughing, I realized it was the first time in close to a year that I'd laughed without checking first to see who was in the room. That small thing cost me more than I can say. Getting it back is worth more than I can say. Callum is working on becoming someone I might one day fully trust again. I am watching, carefully, without rushing. I've learned that love without limits isn't really love. It's just availability, and I am not available, not for the version of things we had. But I am still here. Still his grandmother. Still, after everything, the one who knows where his mother's chin came from and what she looked like on the best days of her life. If you are sitting somewhere tonight and you recognize any part of what I've just told you, the stepping aside, the shrinking, the lying to the walk-in clinic about the cupboard door, I want you to hear this. You are not doing anyone a favor by protecting them from their own consequences. Not your child, not your grandchild, not anyone. The most frightening call I ever made was to Josefa. It lasted 11 minutes. It changed everything. Whatever your version of that call is, make it. I've been thinking about cause and effect a lot lately. Not in a grand philosophical way. I'm not that kind of person. But in the small, practical way you think about things when you're 67 and you've had enough time to watch your own choices come back around to meet you. The truth is, I made Callum's behavior possible. Not intentionally. Not out of weakness, exactly. But I kept stepping aside, and every time I did, I was teaching him something. I was teaching him that the stepping aside was normal, that it was what I did, that there would be no point where I stopped, and people, even people we love, maybe especially people we love, will walk as far as the path goes. It took me 9 months to understand that I had been the one laying the path down. There's nothing dramatic about that realization. It didn't arrive in a flash. It arrived slowly, the way the light comes up in December here, that long, gray, gradual dawn. And it came with a kind of responsibility I hadn't expected. If I'd helped create the situation, then I had to be the one to end it. Not out of anger. Out of honesty. What I know now, that I did not know then, is that protecting someone from consequences is not the same as loving them. I thought they were the same thing for a long time. I thought love meant absorbing whatever came at you and holding steady and not making a scene. My generation was taught that. A lot of women my age were taught that. But what I was actually doing, in the name of love, was removing the only thing that might have reached Callum when nothing else could. Consequences are not punishment. They are information. And I was keeping him in the dark. Josepha understood this. She'd seen it for 27 years across a courtroom table. She didn't lecture me about it, that's not how she operates. But she asked me, very quietly on the phone that night, "What do you think happens if nothing changes?" And that question did more than any speech could have. It asked me to think forward instead of sideways, past the discomfort of the moment to what the moment was building toward. Callum is not a bad person. I want to be clear about that, because I think it's easy to read a story like this and decide someone is simply rotten and then feel relieved that you are not. He was a grieving child who became a young man without enough people willing to tell him the truth. And I was one of those people. I loved him too easily and too quietly, and love without honesty is just comfort. Comfort without honesty is just avoidance. The wrist healed. The mornings are mine again. Glenda and I talk every Sunday, which would have seemed impossible 2 years ago. And that's the thing about clearing out what's broken. Sometimes there's room for what you've given up on. I'm still his grandmother. That part doesn't have an off switch. But I'm also, finally, myself. And those two things I've learned are not in conflict. They were only ever in conflict because I thought they had to be. If you've been stepping aside, I want you to ask yourself the question Josepha asked me. Not out of fear. Out of honesty. What happens if nothing changes? You already know the answer. The only question is when you're going to let yourself hear it.